around it, so that's fine. I beg your pardon, everybody. I don't quite know what happened there. It normally works straight away, but there we are. Right, so as it says there, we're going to have a look at thermal processing for food businesses. And as it's just been said by Miranda, it's going to be basic because we've only got about 40 minutes, 45 minutes for the presentation. So what I want to look at to start off with are some of the key factors relating to temperature as it relates to food safety, of course. So depending on the temperature of the food or depending on temperature of the processing or the storage, it can affect bacterial growth. And I'll explain as we go through exactly what I mean about bacterial growth. And or it can affect bacterial survival. So I'm sure you all know the hotter the temperature, the less likely that bacteria will grow. And if you keep on increasing the temperature, the less likely that bacteria will survive. So we're going to look at all of those as to how it can benefit from food safety, and of course on the reverse, how it can compromise food safety. Now, the other thing about temperature is that depending on the particular bacteria, the increase in temperature can, for example, the increase in temperature can result in the formation of spores or toxins for a particular type of bacteria. So other things is that some bacteria are more prone to damage when they're actually frozen. But you can never rely on the fact that bacteria may not survive the freezing process. So you should always assume that the bacteria will survive the freezing process, and then when the temperature starts to rise, they then can then begin to grow again, or indeed to form their toxins or spores. So I think it's really important to understand that freezing doesn't necessarily kill them. And as I said, you should never rely upon that process as a means of destruction of the bacteria. So thermal processing itself, I want to look at. So that's both the heating and the cooling. And the two key areas that we need to take account of is its importance in relation to food safety. That's the primary concern, of course, for all of us involved in the food industry, whether that's businesses or indeed regulators. And the second thing about thermal processing is that it's, as it says here, at the heart of food preservation. So it's really important to understand how we can actually destroy or reduce the growth of bacteria, particularly those bacteria which cause harm, and of course those that will cause spoilage to the food. The other thing about thermal processing, which is not up there, but as I'm sure you know, it can actually affect the physical nature of the food. It can change its structure, it can change its texture, and of course its appearance. You just need to think of that raw meat, that nice vibrant red color, but as soon as you start adding a heat process to it, it changes color to a much more darker browny color. The other thing just to bear in mind about thermal processing, and when I'm talking about, in this instance, it's the application of heat. What we don't want is to overdo the heat processing if we can avoid it. So clearly the heat processing is to control or destroy bacteria. But if we overdo it, it can actually affect the nutritional benefits of that food itself. So it's just about trying to get the right balance. And that's where the knowledge and understanding of the way bacteria behave is so important. So as I've said, what is thermal processing? Well, of course, as I've just said, it's to eliminate or destroy harmful bacteria which we call pathogens. So a lot of the heat processing, particularly that goes on in the kitchen, in the catering industry, rather than in manufacture, is really aimed at actually reducing pathogens, pathogens being those that are likely to cause harm or illness. And then in the manufacturing industry, many manufacturers are really aiming to actually eliminate the bacteria. So it's all about bringing the microbial load on that food down to a safe level. However, what you need to understand, or what is helpful to understand, is understanding which of those bacteria are the most heat resistant, because you can then design your heat application to take account of those. So what are those bacteria that are more likely to grow during the chilling process? Because once you hit the heat that you're aiming for, and then you want to cool it quickly if it's not going to be served or eaten straight away, then you need to get it as chilled as fast as possible, because you're bringing it down through what we call the danger zone. And there are certain bacteria that will continue to grow as you bring it down through that danger zone, and indeed will continue to grow even under chilled temperatures. And then it's always really useful to understand and know which bacteria are associated with which foods, because then that gives you a better understanding as to which are going to be the greatest risk to the particular product that's being handled or cooked or chilled at a particular point in time. So it's really important to understand a little bit about bacteria and how they grow and what their characteristics are. So we're going to say a few words about that in due course. So that's the basic principles. Destroy or eliminate those that cause illness, or reduce them to safe levels. And that's what we normally are looking at in the kitchen, in the catering industry. So we have to accept that even though there's been a heat process, there's going to be some bacteria that are going to remain. And even in the manufacturing industry, there is always that assumption, even though the heating process may well be designed to eliminate those microorganisms, there is that assumption that some of them will survive. So they may, of course, survive the heating process, but of course, we also need to consider they may actually be further cross-contamination post-processing. So then the idea, of course, is to either slow or to stop their growth once that heating process has been completed. Again, all about food safety in the first instance, and food preservation in the second instance as well. So it relates to both safety and to quality. So I think it's just to remind those of you that are here and are food business operators or working for a food business operator, that it is the responsibility of the FBO to ensure that the food that is produced and sold or served is safe. It is an absolute requirement on the FBO. So for that, they do need to understand what the relevant legislation requires, and hopefully working with safe food and having access to their reference documents and all the assistance that they can give, that will help keep you up to date on the relevant legislation and any guidance that are issued. And I have to say that the Food Safety Authority of Ireland is a superb reference site. And I do a lot of teaching over in the UK, and I can tell you that it provides a far greater and more user-friendly advice service than our Food Standards Agency, and we could learn a lot from them. So it's always my first point of call. So the other thing, of course, that food business operators have to do is to provide a HACCP-based procedure or procedures. And for those of you that are not familiar with HACCP, That means hazard analysis, critical control. So if you're identifying the hazards, and in this case, we're going to be looking at the microbiological hazards, you then have to work out what where their growth characteristics are, and how you can control those growth characteristics. Sorry, not the characteristics, but how you can grow their how can you control their growth and preferably eliminate them, and then implement those controls. So obviously that's heating and cooling are the key things for microbial growth and microbial destruction. So please just think about the hazards associated with the food, and I'm going to show you a few examples as we go through. Now, the one thing I haven't put up there is that you people involved in business may well be slightly worried about the EHOs, slightly being the operable word, of course. But I always tell my clients, don't forget your insurance company, because if you're, well, presumably you are insured, if you're not, if you haven't put in your risk management through your HACCP system, you may find if things go horribly wrong, either you haven't put it in place, you haven't properly designed it, you haven't implemented it, you may find that you're not properly insured. So it's very, very important to make sure that you have a proper HACCP in place. So just then looking at some of the thermal processings that you may well be familiar with. So we've got essentially the mild processing and the more severe processing. So clearly the mild processing is really going to be aiming at reducing the microbes. So we've got blanching, and although that may be subjecting the foods to temperatures in the region of 90 to 100 degrees centigrade, what it's really designed for is actually to destroy enzymes that are going to lead to a poorer quality product. So it's particularly used, of course, in fruit and vegetables. And then you've got your pasteurization process, which is generally considered a mild process, as it says there, and it is often identified as a critical control, and that is designed to reduce the level of microorganisms to what we call a 6 log reduction. I'll show you some time temperatures later. And then you've got your more severe processes. So you've got canning, which is shelf stable, as you know, you can stick it on the shelf, and they call it commercially sterile. So really that is designed to eliminate microbes that are going to cause harm. However, having said that, there may still be some microbes that might survive it, but usually they're controlled by other characteristics of the food. So it might be a relatively low pH to the food, or water activity may be relatively low. And then, of course, you've got your baking, roasting and frying, and those temperatures are generally well over 100 degrees centigrade that the actual cooking equipment is set at. And usually the internal product, the internal nature of the product has reached that temperature as approaching the oven temperature. And then of course we've got cooling of foods, which I'll say a bit more later. So I think some of the key issues then is thinking about the food, thinking about the microorganisms associated with that food. And then certain microorganisms are also associated with packaging. So for example, if you're using vacuum pack, then the microorganisms that we always worry about in particular is Clostridium botulinum, because it will grow in the absence of oxygen. So the important thing then is thinking about the food, and then I'm going to show you some documents in a minute where we can see the types of food and the organisms that are associated with that food. And that's a really good step to try and understand what the hazard is associated with your production. And then we look at what are the most heat resistant of those organisms associated with that product. And then you can set your temperature for heat processing to take account of that most heat resistant of organisms. And then we do need to understand how those organisms can survive and grow during storage. And so therefore, in summary, it's important to know what the microbe associated with that food is, what their minimum temperature is for growth, the optimum temperature for growth. And when we talk about optimum temperatures, that's where the organism will multiply most quickly. And then the maximum temperature of growth. So as soon as you reach that temperature, the organism will stop growing. And once you edge it above that maximum temperature, the organism will start to die off. So I'm just going to try and share. So I'm going to do a new share, hopefully. Hang on a minute, Tracy, I might need your help here just to make sure I get this right. So I'm going to Alt and Tab and hopefully, oh, Alt, oops, what's going on here? Let's try again, Alt and Tab. Right, so what we've got here is a list of, sorry, Tracy, can you see that?
I can, all good.
Yeah, good. It's just not got my green edge around the screen. So what we've got here is 1.5 pages of foods, as you can see down the left-hand side. I just quickly scroll down. You don't need to read them. It's just important knowing that this is available. And then in the right-hand column, it will tell you an indication of the significant organisms or organisms of concern. Now, I've got to go into an ice cream factory next week. I'm just seeing if it's got ice cream on it. Here we go. So in fact, I used this today because I needed to do some sampling in the ice cream factory. So I went to this table and said, right, we definitely need to know about Salmonella and Listeria monocytogenes. So when you're thinking about making your ice cream, for example, then you would think, right, okay, so what is the maximum temperature that Salmonella will grow at, and what's the minimum temperature? And you're trying to reach those temperatures either in the heating process or the cooling process, and the same for Listeria monocytogenes. But it's also useful to know what the optimum temperature is, and I'm going to share that with you in a minute. So Tracy, I need to get back to my presentation, so I'm going to just quickly try. I'm going to press Alt. Is that going to work? Alt Tab. Oh, here we go. Does that take you back to the presentation?
It does, not to the full screen though.
Does that take you to the full screen? Right, good. Okay, so that's how you can identify the organisms of concern relating to the product. Now, that's just one document that you've seen. There's lots of information out there. So what I would suggest if you're going to do that is try and get hold of another document or another reference just to make sure you cover all your bases, because they can slightly differ. So I've talked about the optimal temperature of organisms. And what I mean by that is that they will multiply much more quickly than they would do if they were perhaps in chilled storage. So some of you may have already seen this slide, but I think it's quite a useful slide to see because it just tells you how quickly things can go wrong. Now, if you imagine that you could get 1 million on a pinhead, 1 million Salmonella organisms on the pinhead, and then it perhaps, maybe 7,000 or 8,000 of those to make you unwell. If you look at this, you've got one bacteria. So they do multiply by division, simple division. So after 15 minutes, in this case, you'll get 2 bacteria. If you go off to an hour, you get 16. And then after 3 hours, it goes up to just over 4,000. If you add another hour onto that, you've got 65,500. So you can imagine if you had 1 million of those on that pinhead, which would be virtually impossible. Well, you wouldn't be able to see it with a naked eye. You can imagine in terms of, just to try and get some idea of scale, you can imagine how quickly things can go wrong. So that's why it's really important to keep the organism of concern out of that optimal temperature, or maybe say have it in there for a shorter time as possible. So these are the microbes of interest. We're really concentrating on bacteria today, but you do have viruses. They're considered to be microorganisms, as are parasites. And of course, you've got molds and yeasts. And I know that we do use molds and yeasts in the food industry, but these were molds and yeasts that are going to cause spoilage. But if we're going to concentrate on bacteria today, because we just don't have time to go into the microbiology of all the other all those other microorganisms. So here's another, oops, I'm just trying to get rid of this. I don't know how I get rid of that. Anyway, let's not worry about that too much. And of course, I've messed that up. Let's just take that out. So what you've got here is a chart of organisms, as you can see on the left-hand side. And I'm not sure if you can see the top because mine's actually slightly, so can I get rid of that? No. Anyway, so on this left-hand column, or the column immediately to the right of the organisms, what you've got here, hopefully, is water activity. And in the middle column, you've got the pH, which is the acidic value of the food. Now, I'm not going to go into any detail on that today, but by controlling one or either of those two, by perhaps making the food more acidic or drying the food a bit more, you can actually start to control the growth of the organisms as well. You won't kill them by using these as controls, but you can affect the growth. So that's for a different day. So what we're concentrating on are the temperatures. And again, you can see here charts. So we were talking about Salmonella earlier on. And so the minimum temperature for growth is 4 degrees centigrade. If you look at Listeria monocytogenes that I'm looking at in terms of my ice cream, what you'll immediately see is that Listeria monocytogenes will grow down to below freezing. And in some charts, you'll see that as low as -1.5 degrees centigrade. So you can see why it's important to use one or two different sources to inform you. So I'm just going to quickly go through these just to show you the different types of organisms of interest or concern. And I've put down the minimum temperature for all of those. And we've got Clostridium perfringens. Now, this one is particularly worrying during the chilling process, or indeed if you've got large containers or large cooking kettles or large cooking vats. And the reason that we worry about those is because it takes so much longer to heat the food. And if you've got a great big vat and it's going to take that much longer, and Clostridium perfringens is the organism of concern, it's going to be in this optimal temperature range for longer. And you can see that during optimal conditions, it will double in numbers every 7 minutes. So you go back to that every 15-minute doubling chart, you can just see how worrying that is for us in the food industry. So Campylobacter, you'll notice actually, although Campylobacter is the most common form of food poisoning that we know about, mostly because it's caused by cross-contaminating the domestic kitchen, we believe. But interestingly enough, look, it doesn't grow under refrigerated temperatures. It won't grow below 30 degrees centigrade. Now, I've put those two figures down because, again, you'd always look at the worst case scenario, so 30 degrees centigrade. I'm not reading these out, but it's useful to see. Clostridium botulinum, as I've mentioned already, you've got two types. So one will grow under refrigerated conditions, the other one won't. But they are the most problematic. Well, they're not the most problematic, they're most worrying food poisoning organisms because it poses such a potentially damaging public health risk. And it's the toxin that is formed is actually used in, or they believe it's going to be used, if it's ever going to be used, of course, for biological warfare. You hardly need any to infect you and make you seriously ill. So you can have a look at those temperatures, but as I said, they're two different types. Then you've got your Salmonella. So if you remember, you were looking at Salmonella. So here you've got your 4 to 5.2 degrees centigrade. So you would work on the 4 degrees centigrade. So it multiplies just above body temperature, as you can see here in that region. And so if you can hit 46 degrees centigrade in your heat application, they will stop growing. But if you take it further up, they will start to be destroyed. And here you've got the Listeria monocytogenes, and you can see that loves sort of body temperature-ish. And then you've got E. coli, again, will grow just below 8 degrees centigrade. And that is a slower doubling every 20 minutes. But what you have to worry about this particular organism, the O1571, is that you probably only need between 10 and 100 organisms to make you unwell. And certainly for children under the age of about 7 or 8, it is particularly damaging. It attacks the kidneys in particular, and that's often what will either cause them irreparable kidney damage, or indeed they may not survive. And similarly with people who are in the older age range and particularly underlying health conditions. And then you've got Bacillus cereus. Again, this is associated with growing at chill temperatures, but you need a higher heat application for this one, as you can see. Bacillus cereus associated with rice in particular, and dried herbs and spices. We often consider a Staphylococcus aureus because it's associated with handling. We carry it at any one time. A third of us will be carrying it on our nose, in our ears or mouth, and on our skin. And then it sort of comes and goes. So we always, if you're handling food, ready to eat products, we're concerned about that. So coming back to my ice cream manufacturer, although it only said Salmonella and Salmonella and Listeria, I've added in Staph aureus because they're handling it. I know that they're handling it, adding things to it. So I think you've seen that one. I'm sorry, I forgot to take that one off. So this is an interesting chart as well. So this is if you apply 70 degrees centigrade and hold the temperature for 2 minutes, you will reduce Listeria monocytogenes to what we call a 6-log reduction. And that's a pasteurization time and temperature combination. If you reduce the temperature, as you can see here, to 60 degrees centigrade, you can get this 6-log reduction. So you're reducing the organisms to a safe level. To 43, if you hold it for 43 minutes and 48 seconds, you'll get that 6-log reduction. We round that up to 45 minutes because it's easier to remember. And then some of you will recognize 75 degrees centigrade for 30 seconds. In actual fact, it's 26 seconds, but again, we round it up to 30 seconds. And then for one of the botulinum organisms, if you heat it to 90 degrees centigrade and hold it for 10 minutes, you'll reduce the CBOT to safe levels. And we consider this time temperature combination for the botulinum that's as it says there, the psychotrophic, which I believe is let me just check, it's a non-proteolytic one, the one that will grow under chill conditions, but you're reducing it to a safe level. You're not eliminating it. So these are the sorts of foods that are likely to have or require a heat treatment. So I don't think you'll be surprised at those. And then we've got these time temperature combinations for, again, various types of foods that, for those of you in Ireland, you would be expected to hit in terms of controlling the food poisoning organisms. Now, for my last effort of trying to share my screen, and then I'll have to come back, I'm just going to press that, hopefully. Oops, what's going on? Hopefully. Oh, what's going on? I've taken let's try that again. No, it's not going to work, I don't think. One more time. That's it there. So, Tracy, can you see that document 2?
Yeah.
Yeah, great stuff. So this is just a larger this is a larger document that provides a little bit more information, but you can see here's the liquid egg, which was the first one, and it's post-processing, packing, and then you've got the pathogen of concern here. So again, it's showing you some of those organisms of concern where there's been some form of where there needs to be some form of heat treatment as well. And it's, essentially, you can see the type of packing. So you've got ham and luncheon meat. That's going to be in a can or a jar, and it's going to be heated within that container. And then that where you've got a lot of products that are heated in a container or a pack, like the cans or the jars, you'll see here that Clostridium botulinum is the organism of concern, because essentially it's in an anaerobic conditions, and then it gives you a sort of shelf life, and the A stands for shelf stable product, so you can stick that into your dry store, and then it gives you your references as well. So I'm not going to go through all of that, but you can see that at a later stage. Right, I need to get back to my presentation. So there we are. Oh, it's worked, hopefully. So can you see that, Tracy?
I can.
All right, thank you very much. Sorry about this, everybody. Right, so what can affect thermal processing? So I've looked at obviously the heating temperature, but the actual food itself can affect the thermal processing. So very large products, of course, it was going to take longer for the heat transfer from the outside of the product into the core, or the thickest part of the product. So the size or the volume, if it happens to be a liquid. Very fatty foods can protect organisms, for example. So, you know, I'm not going to go into the chemistry of all of that, but you'll look at those tables that I've already shown you, but that's just a guide. So, for example, we know that chocolate will protect Salmonella. It's essentially what happens is that the chocolate surrounds the organism, and as it passes through the very acidic stomach, it is protected by the fat within the chocolate. So they would take that into account when they're heating the chocolate to make sure that either they've got other controls in place other than heating, or they'll heat it to the temperature to try and reduce the numbers by a greater factor than 6 log reduction. So obviously the type of equipment that's going to be used to heat will impact on the thermal processing, and the nature of the heat transfer is important as well. So you've got convection, conduction, and radiation. So again, without going into all the physics, it's important to understand how the heat transfer is going to take place. So you've got the equipment itself, and obviously the amount of product within the cooker, that's going to affect the heat transfer and the thermal processing. So the greater number of products in the oven or the retort is going to take longer for the heat to transfer to essentially to the midpoint of those cookers or the retorts. But just to add to the confusion, you are likely to get hot spots within the cooking vessels themselves. You know, if you're in the manufacturing industry, that would need to be taken into account. Or if you're using very low temperature processing to achieve a pasteurization, such as in sous vide, you would need to have an idea about where the cool spots are. And then you've got the heat transfer media. I'll show you that in a minute. And you've got cold spots, of course, within the equipment, as I've just said, but you can get cold spots within the product. So again, you might have a ham joint, and you're going to have cooler spots in that ham joint. So, you know, if you've got the thick part of muscle and then you've got the bone, it may well be that in that thicker part of the muscle by the bone, that's going to be potentially cooler than it is going to be on the outside. And then the type of packaging may affect the thermal processing as well. So as I've mentioned, you've got cans, you've got bottles, you've got plastic. So depending if there's if the product's actually in the packaging, then that will all need to be taken into account. You can't just make assumptions. So here you've got large kettles. So we would worry about Clostridium perfringens in here. That's the one that grows very rapidly. So I haven't photographed the inside of that, but they've got a paddle in here, and it turns, and it allows for greater more even heat transfer. And then you get these great big cooking vessels. So if you can imagine, you might, depending where the heat is actually applied, you know, you'd need to do some trials on this, but you could start to get a heat spot, sort of, cool spot here or right bang in the middle. And there's no paddle in here. So it may well be that they will be lifting the lid every now and then and doing a manual paddle, but that would need to all be taken into account. And detailed trials will need to be done. And then you've got your retorts. So again, you can see that this is sort of with the trays in, potentially where assuming these are trays, you know, there may well be cool spots. It just depends where the heat is being applied. So again, you can see how that would work. So here we've got a pate that's been subject to sous vide. You can see that it's in its plastic bag. And what you would need to be able to do is to determine here. So where's my little mouse gone? It's always the way. Here it is. So what you're looking at is where is the slowest heating part of that product. And you would need to make sure, because we would need to pasteurize this product at the very least, you would need to determine exactly where the slowest heating part is and to be able to measure it. I'll show you that in a minute. But here you've got these very low these containers for very low temperature processing for sous vide. And here you've got a little paddle. So you've got the heat transfer in a different way to one where you've just simply got convection. So you've got forced water being forced around. So that's going to be potentially a quicker method of transferring the heat than when you've got convection. This is heated from the bottom. I'm just going to show you a very quick video. It takes a few seconds to click on, but you can just see what they're doing on sous vide. I'll do a little commentary where necessary. So just bear with me. I'm just conscious of the time, so I need to speed up. So he's putting the chicken into the sous vide bag. Now that chicken has to be completely pasteurized all the way through, because we know that the organisms of concern are throughout the product. So he's just vacuum packing that. Don't worry about any of this. If ever you do my sous vide course, I'll explain all of that. So this is just for heat transfer. So he's just checking that the seal's good, as you would do in anything. He's taking the temperature of the water. So this is verifying the temperature of the water. He's putting a self-sealing strip onto that, and he's putting a fine needle probe in so that he can monitor the temperature of the product. So you can see this is the temperature of the product. That's the temperature of the water. And so that's monitored all the way through. And then eventually he'll bring it out. You can see he's just taking he's working out how long it takes for the product itself to reach the temperature which he wants it to reach, which is 64 degrees centigrade. And he's taking the core of the temperature, and that's taken 45 minutes to hit it's taking 45 minutes in order to reach 64 degrees centigrade. Let's get rid of that. So he would then need to hold it at 64 degrees centigrade. If we go back to this chart here, so he's reached the 64 degrees temperature. Where's my chart? Of course, I passed it. I just want to quickly show you this. Here it is. So he's hit 64 degrees centigrade. That's taken him 45 minutes. He would then need to hold it. So it says 12.66 seconds, 12.66 minutes. So he would then have to hold it in that water bath for another 13 minutes. So you would add on the 45 minutes plus the 13, and then he would be comfortable that he has reached the 6 log reduction in the organisms of concern. So that's how that works in practice. And the similar principle would apply to whatever the cooking vessel is, whether it is the retort, whether it is a big oven, whether it's any of these things. They would work out where the slowest heating part of the product or products are and they would do their trials like you've just seen my colleague Greg doing, and work out how long these things need to be in the oven, to get the temperature, and then to hold it hold it for the right time using one of those charts. So hopefully that makes a bit of sense. So I've just put this slide in to show you the heat transfer coefficients, the heat transfer media. So you can see if you're using condensing steam, there is a really fast heat transfer. But if you've just got static air, you've got a very low heat transfer. So that's why if you're keeping something at room temperature to cool, it takes a long time. If you were to put it under moving water, so if you were to put your can under running water, you can see how quickly, compared to just leaving it at room temperature, you'll get that reduction in heat. So that's what we mean by heat transfers. You can have a look at that later. So the other thing, just coming back to sous vide, what you don't want to do after you've done your trials, if you've only put one pouch in there, one pouch in there, if you were to put 5 or 6 pouches in there, what would happen potentially is those pouches can come together, because there is movement in this water. As you heat water, it will move. And if those pouches come together, it will take 4 times as long for the correct temperature to reach the center. So you can see if you're relying on 13 minutes to hold it at the right temperature, plus the 45 minutes, you're going to have to times that all by 4. So you can see that the importance of knowing what's going on in the heating process. So I just want to say then a few words about, well, what do you need to do in terms of understanding your cooking vessels. So I've just shown you the sous vide, but you've got your retorts and various other things. So assuming this is some sort of retort system, you would need to map in the oven the temperature distribution, and they can do that using thermocouples. So they would place those strategically and to try and work out where the slowest heating part of the oven is, so that when they come to do the trials for the food, that is where they're going to be concentrating on to actually measure the core temperature of the food. And then so when you measure the core temperature of the food, that's called the heat penetration of the product. So you can have a look at those little diagrams, and that's the source that I got it from, Food Safety Authority of Ireland. And it's guidance note 20. I didn't put the note on there, but it is actually guidance note 20. And there's various ways of monitoring food while it's in its containers or its cans or bottles. So you can just see, you saw on Greg's how he did that. They just put these fine needle probes in where you've got, in this case, a plastic container, and where you've got your cans, for example, they'll either put thermocouple, well, they won't put thermocouples in, but they'll use again some sort of probe that they would put in, and it's all sealed so that it replicates the final product. So then on cooling, it's absolutely crucial that once, assuming that the heat treatment has completed, to start cooling as soon as possible, and in using the fastest method as possible as well. So really you need to get that thickest part down of the product. So taking a leg of ham or a leg of pork, the thickest part down as quickly as possible to 10 degrees centigrade or lower. And then your final chilling is getting it down to 5 degrees as quickly as possible, and then putting it into storage immediately. So there's various ways of cooling. I've got a client who has 2 large blast chillers. But again, you need to be very careful about let me rephrase that. You need to be careful about overstocking it, because of course the more products that are in there, the slower the cooling process is going to be. So he's got a blast chiller. You can get very small tabletop ones, and you can get the floor standing ones for those of you that are in catering. But in the manufacturing industry, often they'll have walk-in blast chillers. And then once it's reached to the final chilling, it should then be moved out into the storage so that again, you're reducing the number of products in that blast chiller to facilitate a faster cooling process. You can use a quenching process. So again, in manufacturing, they may well have a quenching process with cold water, but even in catering, that can be done as long as the water that's they can either place it in the water within the cooking pot, or they can cover it in a watertight container and use running water, or just simply place it in a sink with cold water, and then maybe within 15 to 20 minutes replace that cold water with another load. So it's really important so what I wanted to just mention, of course, is hygiene, and why is that important? So the larger the loads on the initial ingredients, the more likely the numbers of organisms are going to survive any pasteurization process. So using ingredients at the beginning of their shelf life is really important, and making sure that there's they're good quality ingredients coming in, and they're protected when it's in your possession from any environmental or other food cross-contamination risks. So different products carry different organisms or associated with different organisms, as you've already seen. So again, it's just making sure that good quality products, and of course you get cross-contamination within the production unit or the kitchen, both from on utensils and equipment. So we always like to separate out those areas where we call them the low care areas. I'm not sure I like that phrase, but and then you've got your high care areas, whereas usually the ready to eat products particularly are held, and we're always trying to protect that ready to eat product. So it's really understand the importance of hygiene and how that can affect any heat treatments that you're doing. I've just put in this little acronym for cleaning. Remember, you've got to take proper time and thought to your cleaning. You've got the physical action of removing the gross dirt, and you've got your chemical concentrations of your disinfectants, and knowing what the contact time is, knowing what the dilution rates are, and many sanitizers or disinfectants will actually have a shelf life of their own. So knowing that as well, really important to know all of that. And then the hotter the temperature, well, no, let me rephrase that. Good hot temperature for cleaning really helps to soften the fats and the proteins, and will certainly assist in the cleaning process. What you don't always want is, depending on the type of product that you're dealing with, you sometimes don't want to have too hot a temperatures, particularly if it's in a cleaning in place type of cleaning regime, because that can actually bake on the proteins onto the surface. So again, it's really important understanding how these organisms can behave in relation to cleaning, but that's for probably a different day. So the thing about your heat treatment, or your thermal processing, whether that's the heat, whether that's the cooling, you need to be able to prove that it's safe. So usually trials are important, particularly in the manufacturing and production industries, to show that you understand where the cool spots are in the cooking equipment. How to actually monitor and verify where the thickest part of the product is, and how you're going to monitor the temperature of that. So you do need appropriate instrumentation, and you need, which is usually the sort of the probe thermometers. You can get thermocouples, and of course you can get data loggers, which will, so these two will measure the temperature at a particular moment in time, and you can look at it and say, oh yeah, it's 32 degrees centigrade, or it's 36.7. Where the data loggers, what you can do is that they will stay in the product or in the oven, and they will give you a sort of a running result of how quickly the temperature rises, when it rises, and how quickly the temperature falls. So again, that's often associated with industry. with the manufacturing and the production. And also what these tell you is if there's been any interruption in any of the heat treatment or the cooling treatments. So when we talk about fine needle probes, you can see the difference between the thick, normal, usual general purpose probe for measuring as you put it into your soup. These are very much designed for going into containers and then self-sealing, and that's a thermocouple there. So I'm sure you're used to that. So the equipment needs to be calibrated. So these sort of day temperatures, the ones that are used daily or periodically, need to be calibrated against a reference instrument, and that reference instrument has usually been sent away every 3 years or thereabouts, and it's calibrated by a laboratory against national or international standards. So that's when the calibration should take place. And you should get a certificate as well. And I've just put this certificate up because it's really important, and people forget this. It's really important that here's a test, here's the results. So you need to be clear about what temperature you're wanting to be monitoring. So if you see here, you've got 0 degrees centigrade, and there's a difference between the two of 0.3 degrees centigrade. 100 degrees centigrade, you can see there's a 0.8 degrees centigrade difference. Now, normally you allow a tolerance of between 0.5 degrees centigrade and 1.5 degrees centigrade. You know, obviously we're looking at the tolerance of about half a degree centigrade. But if you were doing a sous vide, for example, and you wanted to get a temperature of around about 75 degrees centigrade, it is out of tolerance. So that's 75, that's 1.5 degrees centigrade out of tolerance. And that could be the difference between a safe product and an unsafe product. So when they go off for testing, you need to be clear about what your key temperatures are, and make sure that the calibration certificates, something like this, is available, and you understand what it means. So just quickly and finally, don't forget record keeping is really important. This is all about your due diligence, all about keeping the EHO happy, but don't forget your insurance company. So, you know, they will want to know if everything's gone horribly wrong and you've got a massive product recall, or worse, you know, people have died because you've eaten a product that hasn't been properly processed. You can have your due diligence records available to show that it was a one-off incident. And then just finally, I've just put this in as some of my clients use cryogenic cooking. And of course, liquid nitrogen will freeze products really, really quickly. So if you think about a deep fat fryer is set at around about 175 degrees centigrade, liquid nitrogen freezing is minus about 175 degrees centigrade. And if you ever think about doing this, there's all sorts of health and safety controls you need to put in, because otherwise you'll have a deep frozen nose or a deep frozen finger. So I finished a minute over. I do apologize, everybody. I was faffing about with my presentation earlier. So thank you very much. And I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Miranda. That was indeed very, very interesting, I have to say, and very thorough presentation you just gave us. We have a number of questions in for you. Well, a lot of them are the same, and I suppose I was wondering the same thing. You showed us a lot of useful references there. Are the ones you showed, are they freely available online, or?
So the FSAI ones are, the Food Safety Authority of Ireland's ones are. There was one that I showed, I think it was from the Steel book. That's not available. It cost me, it's a big book, and I'm afraid it costs about £350.
Okay, we might get the links to the ones that are freely available.
Yeah, so I think mostly I use the FSAI ones because obviously it's very relevant.
Yeah.
So yeah, Camden BRI do a lot of work, but again, they will charge for their reference documents.
Yeah. Okay.
And they certainly have got specialists that will come out, and I know they do come out to Ireland. There are others, food safety consultancies out there, but I do know they specialise in sort of heat transfer and thermal processing.
Perfect. Well, we'll try and share the ones that are available then with when we're sending out the link to the recording. Someone has asked a few questions here. Someone's asked about the canning process, and if a can gets damaged, does it affect the product, or is this kind of some kind of myth?
So when
you know, if a can's dented, you know the way if a can's dented.
Oh, it dented. Yes, you would assume that I mean, that certainly. I'm not a canning expert, but I know certainly when I first started training all those years ago, damaged cans, they actually damaged the inside, the coating inside, and they were they were considered as don't use them. I suspect nowadays they're probably better protected inside, but personally I personally wouldn't touch a can, because you can get it's probably not going to be a food safety issue, but so from a microbiological point of view, but you'll start to get potentially migration of chemicals into the product from the damaged lining. That's going to be the concern.
Yeah, perfect. Okay. And someone's asking, just out of interest probably, what is the purpose of the sous vide method you showed there?
Come on my course, I'll tell you. There's loads of advantages. I mean, usually the sous vide, what I was showing you in here, is usually for caterers. Okay. Rather, you can get large sous vide processing in manufacturing, which is very much done for convenience. But sous vide processing, as I said, can be done for convenience. It's really good for portion control. It's very good for consistency. So if it's done in a central production unit, it makes it much easier. But a lot of the fine dining chefs, and I've dealt with loads of them in my time, they will use sous vide, not for those reasons, but it can make the foods, particularly meat products, much more tender. You don't lose the volatiles because it's all within this pouch. So it has a better flavour, a better odour to it. And the other issue, of course, is it can extend the shelf life because it's vacuum packed. So they can sometimes use it for extending the shelf life. But there's lots of benefits, but those are just a few. And it's delicious when it's done at those low temperatures.
No, that's what I was wondering. Okay. Someone is asking, this is quite a broad question, and I suppose you showed a number of organisms, but is there one of most concern? I suppose that depends on a lot of factors, but I'll let you answer that.
Yes, it depends on what the product is and what the method of either packing or the method of processing. So I mentioned about botulinum. So if you're processing a can or putting any product under an anaerobic condition or vacuum packing it, botulinum is absolutely the organism that everyone freaks out about because it is so dangerous. So that would depend on the packaging, particularly. Okay. If you've got, I showed you that really large cooking vessel, the square, the oblong one. And we used the organism of concern for those is Clostridium perfringens, because it multiplies so quickly as you take it up from, if your product's coming out the fridge and you're trying to get it up to a temperature, say, of 95 degrees centigrade, the bigger the container, the slower potentially it takes that core of the product to pass through that optimal. So we worry about Clostridium perfringens, and that produces a toxin, and it's difficult. Well, the toxin normally actually is produced in the body, but it can also be produced on the food in some circumstances. And then the heat treatment itself won't denature the toxin. So we worry about those great big fats of products, just to name a few. And then if you've got chicken that you may be sous videing, you've got Campylobacter, which is throughout the whole product. So if that's not properly processed, you could be experiencing unpleasant gastroenteritis, shall we say?
Yeah,
and I could go on and on, but those are just 3 examples.
Okay, thank you, Miranda. Someone's asking, just with when cooking rice, is there a safe way to make it last a few days? Does it have to be eaten within 24 hours?
So the thing with rice is, as you saw there, I can't remember, what did I say about the rice? Yeah, so so you need to get it, certainly you need to properly boil it, that's the first thing. Cool it very rapidly, and get it under, if you can get it under 3 degrees centigrade, of course, in a commercial kitchen, then it won't be growing. So in terms of shelf life, usually on that sort of thing, if it's, I would say probably a day of production plus 2 days in the fridge. If you want to keep it longer than that, the one thing that you can do is, and they do this with sushi rice, where they're wanting to use it in you know, the Japanese restaurants, they will add a vinegar solution to it, sort of like a Chinese vinegar or lemon juice. So you can drop the pH down, and that will stop the growth of Bacillus aureus, which is the organism associated with rice.
Perfect. And we just have one more question, and it's specifically about Table 1 resource detailing bacteria affecting different food types.
Yeah.
Someone's asking, can you repeat where it's from, where that table is from?
Yeah, I actually got it from I got it from a book that you arranged to be sent over, which I don't think's available to anybody at the moment. I'm just wondering whether it's in the FSAI. It may be in the FSAI document, actually. But what I would say is that we can, if I copy the link, if I copy the document as a PDF document, I'm sure that won't be a problem.
Okay, well, I know that document's being published in December, so it will be freely available, so we can let people know that then. Okay, that is all the questions, unless anyone else has a quick one they want to type in the box before we go. If not, that's us. And I suppose the video of the Knowledge Network is playing at the start. So if anyone wants to hear any more about our upcoming events or our resources, you can join our Knowledge Network at safefoodkn.net. And I suppose Tracy will be